This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
First of all, I want to thank Philip for this introduction, and I would like to thank Philip and John and Peter for including me in this wonderful event. I have learned an immense amount, and in fact, I'm very grateful to Peter especially, who lent me his office during the lunch hour so I could include some emendations to my text that were inspired by all the papers that I have listened to so far. So I've engaged in the tradition of textual emendation over lunch in Peter's office. But for now, let's turn our attention. Can everybody hear me? Is this okay? Can you hear me? Hold on a second. Let me just try to fix this microphone so everybody, that's wonderful. So we can get this to be a little darker. Okay, is that better?
Is that all right?
I can definitely see my paper. That's not a problem. Everybody can hear me now, I suppose. Yeah, great. All right. Antonio Allegri da Correggio is one of the most enigmatic painters of the Italian Renaissance. Traditionally seen as a provincial artist with little direct knowledge of classical antiquity, he has often been set in opposition to the worldly erudite Titian. But the erudition of Correggio's sensuous and delicate oeuvre has in fact been greatly underestimated. Particularly intriguing is the small corpus of mythological paintings executed in the last decade of the artist's life, that is between 1524 and 1534, whose subjects radically deviate from the religious images he produced for most of his career. Within the small mythological corpus, the Io, which you see on the screen, merits special attention. As a number of scholars have noted, Correggio's Io, painted between 1530 and 1531, breaks with earlier iconographies of this myth, presenting the viewer with an innovative reimagining of the story in which pleasure and metamorphosis are fused into one emblematic moment. And just to give you a sense of what other Renaissance representations of the myth of Io generally look like, I'm showing you here a page from a 16th century French translation of the Metamorphoses, now in the Bodleian Library, in which the nymph's future bovine appearance is a key element of the composition. And just to break down the image a little bit, let's see if I can get my pointer here. On the foreground, you see Jupiter and Io. The river is labeled as the river Inachus, le fleuve Inac. We have Juno coming down from Olympus in her glorious chariot. And back here, we have a prolaptic image of Io as a cow, which has been very helpfully labeled. It's hard to see in the slide, but it's been labeled Io vache. Just so, in case you didn't know what the cow was doing there, in case you mistook her just as a sort of generic pastoral element, no, it's part of the myth. All right, and this is the presence of the cow in representations of the myth of Io is sort of classic. Oops, what happened there? Okay, it went away. It's sort of a classic motif in other Renaissance representations of the Io, and of course she's not there in the Correggio. Although Correggio's debt to Ovid's Metamorphoses has been generally regarded as unproblematic, his composition in fact reverses the poet's account of Io's transformation by changing Jupiter into a cloud while preserving the nymph's human form. On the screen, I'm juxtaposing Correggio's painting to two short but key passages from Metamorphoses Book 1 that constitute the literary backdrop to the painting on the left. In the first passage, we have Ovid's account of the rape of Io, which in many ways recalls the longer narrative of Apollo's attempt to seduce Daphne that appears earlier in Book 1. So like Daphne, Io's first response to Jupiter's courting is to flee. And in fact, she had already left behind Lerna's pastures and the Lucean fields thickly planted with trees, when the god, that is Jupiter himself, hid the white earth with a fog, having been spread over it. And he put a stop to her flight and ravished her. Here, the fog, caligo, that is conjured by Jupiter is, among other things, an expression of his power and the obvious inequality between the two protagonists. The second passage recounts Io's first metamorphosis, because of course she's turned into a cow, and then later she's turned again into a maiden and into a goddess. And so here we have, in this passage, Ovid's description of Io's first metamorphosis. And this takes place a few verses after the passage I just read, and in the meantime, Juno has figured out that there is a cloud that shouldn't be there. What is this cloud doing in the middle of the day down in this valley? Aha, my husband is up to something. I'm going to go check it out. So as Juno is descending from heaven, Jupiter, of course, had presaged his wife's brilliant arrival and changed the appearance of Inachus' daughter into a cow. The cow, too, is beautiful. Although in some passages, such as Daphne's transformation into a laurel tree, Ovid describes the character's process of changing into a new form quite vividly and carefully. Here, instead, he offers an instantaneous transformation scene. And although we can continue to discuss how text and image differ from one another for a very long time, these are the two principal differences I want to emphasize now. One, the appearance of the cloud, which is really a means for Jupiter to seize Io and impose his desire on her. And the other one is this way in which Correggio obviously slows down, almost freezes the process of metamorphosis in his painting, which is very different from the way that Ovid treats the same event in the poem. In this ardently sexual painting, the cloud that, according to Ovid, was conjured by Jupiter to conceal his dalliance from Juno becomes the god's body, or at least his earthly manifestation. He envelops the nymph's luminous form with a dark anthropomorphic mass that threatens to engulf her and conceal her from our sight. At the same time that Jupiter reaches down for a kiss, Io throws back her head, eager to receive her lover. Instead of the well-known narrative of Io's attempted flight and her subsequent ravishment, Correggio presents us with an image of mutual desire and pleasure. The intense eroticism of the scene is, however, tempered by a certain tenderness that is communicated through the nymph's pose and gestures. By showing us the nymph's back, Correggio uses Io's body to block our visual access to the lover's embrace, presenting us instead with an obstructed view of the sexual act. Though titillating, this image can hardly be described as pornographic. Moreover, the nymph's facial expression, her softened gaze, and the gentleness with which she wraps her arm around the god's paw-like limb suggest that sexual intimacy is, in this case, interlaced with sentiment. And just to make clear what I'm trying to describe in relation to Correggio's Io, I'm here comparing the painting by Correggio to a contemporary fresco after a drawing by Giulio Romano depicting Jupiter and Olympia that is in the Palazzo del Te in Mantua. Federico II Gonzaga, who had his pleasure palace built and decorated between 1524 and 1534, was also the patron who commissioned the Io and other mythological paintings by Correggio. Federico's love of antiquity and his taste for prurient representations of the loves of the gods are well attested. Yet it is striking that, given his patron's taste and his knowledge of Giulio Romano's work, Correggio chose to approach his own Amori di Giove, and the Io in particular, in a very different style. And for those of you who are not familiar with Correggio's works, the mythological works, the series of Amori di Giove that he painted for Federico Gonzaga included not only the Io, but a Ganymede, a Danae, and a Leda. And if you'd like to see those images, I can show them to you during the Q&A. While questions regarding textual sources for Correggio's Io and the artist's appropriation and reinterpretation of classical texts have drawn comparatively little attention, art historians have long debated which ancient and modern iconographic models might have inspired his unusual portrayal of this myth. The so-called Ara Grimani, an ancient monument found in Rome in the early 1500s that Correggio may have known firsthand, has often been pointed to as one of his sources. As you can see from the photograph on the right, one of the altar's reliefs features a charming depiction of a satyr kissing a nymph. The overall tone of this composition and the nymph's pose both recall Correggio's treatment of the myth of Io. But the figure of Io also closely resembles one of Raphael's nymphs on the ceiling of the loggia of Cupid and Psyche in the Villa Farnesina in Rome. A work of art Correggio must have known through Giulio Romano's drawings and may have seen during a possible trip to the Eternal City. This is one of the big questions in Correggio's scholarship, was whether Correggio ever went to Rome or not. Nobody seems to come to an agreement, but in any case, we know that Giulio Romano, who participated in the painting of the ceiling in Rome, was in Mantua at the same time that Correggio was working for the Gonzaga court, and we know that Correggio and Giulio worked together, and that Correggio had access to the drawings that Giulio had brought with him from Rome. Although the turn of the nymph's head in Raphael's design differs from Io's, the arrangement of the nymph's legs are very similar. In fact, it's basically the same figure. So you can see here that this odd arrangement of legs in Correggio's painting, this odd tilting back of the leg, is very similar to the way that this figure is sitting in this rather twisted position here. The heads, of course, are different, but the body and the legs are very similar. Also, I'd like you to notice that there are clouds here framing these three figures, because they are, of course, nymphs that are attending the wedding banquet of Cupid and Psyche in Olympus. So the clouds here are indicating their current heavenly address. More recently, Marcin Fabianski has suggested that Correggio, in conceiving his Io, may also have been inspired by ancient gems, such as this cameo depicting Venus and Jupiter's eagle in the Hermitage. The stark contrast between dark and light tones and the rather shallow pictorial space of Correggio's canvas lend the Io the appearance of a large-scale gem. As such, this painting engages in an aesthetic of compression, reducing a long and complex narrative into a single electrifying scene. Yet, this ongoing debate about Correggio's visual sources for the Io tends to obfuscate an important facet of this work. Far from being an unprecedented outlier in Correggio's oeuvre, the Io marks a turning point in the artist's engagement with classical subjects and the challenge of translating words into images. Almost nothing is known about Correggio's training as an artist and humanist. But between 1517 and 1519, he began to identify himself through a Latinized version of his name, Antonius Laetus, as you can see from this detail from a copy of the now lost Madonna of Albinea. And I know it's a bit dark, because the painting itself, the section of the painting is rather dark, but you can see here on the stone that he has inscribed his name, Antonius Laetus Faciebat. And this appellation, Antonius Laetus, appears not only in paintings from this period, but he starts signing documents, contracts for his work with the same name. So he really becomes Antonius Laetus. As Giancarlo Pariti has persuasively argued, the artist's act of renaming himself represents more than a bilingual pun on his patronymic, Allegri. So from the Italian Allegri, we get lieto in Italian, which then translates into Laetus in Latin. Instead, this act of renaming himself communicates both Correggio's unique artistic identity and his understanding of the highly philological discourse on the emotions that informed contemporary aesthetic debates in the learned courtly milieu of his hometown of Correggio. In the humanistic parlance of 16th century Correggio, Letizia signified an inner spiritual joy, while allegrezza was defined as a sensual bodily pleasure. Hence, the explanation why he didn't go for a form of allegri and chose instead to change it twice, first into allegri into lieto and lieto into Laetus. By renaming himself Laetus, Correggio not only claimed lietezza, laetizia, as his signature style, but also turned this concept into an artistic manifesto. For as Giorgio Vasari himself observed, Correggio's paintings had the power to move the beholder's mind to joy. But the delight provoked by Correggio's paintings was not meant to be just a visual pleasure. There was also an intellectual aspect to Correggio's Laetitia. In other words, part of the pleasure derived from Correggio's images was triggered by an interactive exchange between viewer and work of art that was mediated, of course, by the artist. Take, for instance, Correggio's portrait of a lady of circa 1519. Although the sitter's identity has long been a matter of debate, she can be identified by her dress as a young aristocratic widow belonging to the Third Order of St. Francis. And you should notice here on her knee, here, this is the Franciscan tertiary girdle that indicates her membership to this lay order. Despite this visible mark of her religious devotion, this beautiful young lady is shown in a seductive three-quarter view. Her alluring, sidelong gaze is directed toward the viewer, to whom she seems to proffer a large silver vessel. She thus entices the beholder to enter into a dialogue with the image. The key to this dialogue lies in the elegant Greek inscription that adorns the lady's bowl. And hopefully, it's a little hard to see, but it's right here. If you focus your eyes, you can see that there's a Greek inscription right next to her thumb. The inscription's central word, nepenthes, alludes to Helen's analgesic elixir. It looks much better on paper than it does on the tongue. Okay, so nepenthes alludes to Helen's analgesic elixir in the Telemachy. But how should we understand this Homeric reference in the context of Correggio's painting? As Giancarlo Pariti has suggested, the painter's evocation of the Homeric nepenthes must be understood in relation to the sitter's biography. The death of her husband is the sorrow for which she has sought solace. But the fact that the cup is empty indicates that her suffering has been soothed and that she has found a new joy, possibly through the prospect of a second marriage. Yet we might also argue that the sight of this beautiful lady and the pleasure of deciphering the cup's contents offer the viewer a pleasant draught, capable of lifting his or her spirits. A similar dialogic method of engaging the viewer also informs Correggio's treatment of mythological subjects in the lunettes of the Camera di San Paolo in Parma, painted around 1518-1519 for the greatly learned abbess Giovanna Piacenza. But among the many classical subjects that decorate these frescoed lunettes, the punishment of Hera, which you see on the right, stands out as an especially erudite, coded image. Zeus's punishment of his wife, described in a short passage of Homer's Iliad, is rarely represented in the visual arts. To give visual form to this unusual subject, Correggio transformed the well-known depiction of Marsyas bound to a tree into an image of Hera suspended between heaven and earth. But as several scholars have noted, Correggio's portrayal of this goddess is surprising for a number of reasons. Not only is she depicted as a very young and beautiful woman, but Correggio's Hera also appears to bear her suffering effortlessly. For Erwin Panofsky, this depiction of Hera ought to be interpreted through the lens of several ancient and modern commentaries on Homer as the personification of air. But more recently, Giancarlo Pariti has read this very same image in light of Giovanna Piacenza's own experiences as a nun. While entrance into an aristocratic convent like San Paolo offered Giovanna the chance to dedicate herself to the pursuit of knowledge and achieve a position of power within her monastic order, life as an abbess was not without its difficulties. Tensions with the male members of the Curia over the autonomy of convents like San Paolo in 16th century Italy were a constant reminder of how tenuous the nuns' control over what they considered their property truly was. How exactly Correggio's punishment of Hera was interpreted by either Giovanna or those whom she received in this room is ultimately impossible to say. However, my point here is that, regardless of what message one derived from this image, Correggio's punishment of Hera, like his contemporaneous portrait of a lady, lured the viewer both through the beauty of its subject and its erudite reference to classical literature. In both paintings, Homer's words are translated into images whose interpretation hinges on the beholder's knowledge of the original text, and in the case of the portrait, of the original Greek itself. But the Io is a different story. In this painting, it is not so much Ovid's poetry, but his poetics that Correggio translates into oil and canvas. In its abbreviated synthetic form, the Io dramatizes the interplay between seen and unseen, interior and exterior, and presence and absence. There are also recurring motifs in the Metamorphoses, not least in the episode of Io itself. Moreover, this dreamlike vision of the god's ephemeral embrace presents Metamorphosis as a metaphor for the creative process, setting Correggio's work on a par with Ovid's transformative poem. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Italian artists and humanists such as Leon Battista Alberti, Jacopo dei Barbari, Titian, and Paolo Pino saw the arts of painting and poetry as being intimately connected. In fact, in relation to painting, the term poesie came to denote the representation of independent mythological inventions. That this definition of poesia was widely diffused and accepted among 16th century northern Italian artists is clear from Pino's Dialogo di Pittura, published in Venice in 1548, where he declares poetry an essential part of the painter's craft. Having divided painting into its three traditional components, disegno, design, colorito, coloring, and invenzione, invention, Pino writes, invenzione means the finding of poesie and stories in and of themselves, because painting is properly speaking poesia, that is, invention. Correggio's Io is then a poesia, for it is more than just an illustration of a mythical narrative. It is a witty transformation of a rare mythological subject and a sophisticated pictorial invention designed to draw the eyes and minds of the spectators through its layers of visual and textual references. For although Ovid's account of the tale of Io may be considered Correggio's primary literary source, the artist introduced a number of variations in his depiction of this myth that brought it closer to other modern texts. Luba Friedman, for instance, has interpreted the Io in light of contemporary Neoplatonist debates on the nature of love and desire, which would have been very much au courant at the court in Mantua during the years when Correggio was working on his mythologies for Federico Gonzaga. Luba Friedman's Neoplatonist interpretation of Correggio's Io centers on the image of a stag's head, which you see, or maybe you don't see. It's rather hard to see, so you have to sort of focus your eyes. The stag's head is right here, and he's shown drinking water from the river. It's visible in the painting itself, but I still can't find a single reproduction of this painting where the stag's head looks all that legible. So please bear with me. And believe me, it's there. So Luba Friedman's interpretation, Neoplatonist interpretation, centers on the image of a stag's head, which is on the lower right corner of the painting. She interprets this image as an allegorical symbol taken from the French chanson de geste, signifying insatiable desire and a foreboding of death. For her, the painting represents love as ever unsatisfied, ever increased desire. Ultimately, she sees Correggio's Io as a representation of bittersweet love, a mix of ephemeral delight and lifelong suffering, a concept that she compares to Marsilio Ficino's own description of erotic love as dulce amarum. But it is also possible that in transforming Ovid's tale of ravishment into a scene of mutual desire and pleasure, Correggio was also drawing from less erudite sources, namely 16th century Italian translations of the Metamorphoses, and translations here should be understood in quotation marks. In one such vulgarization of Ovid's poem, Niccolò di Agostini's Metamorfosi, cioè trasmutazioni tradotte del latino diligentemente in volgar verso, and diligentemente should be taken with a grain of salt, Printed in Venice numerous times in the 1520s and 30s, the translator inserts a whole ottava in which Jove is said to court Io like a gallant lover, igniting in the reluctant nymph a reciprocal longing for him. And this is the text you see on the screen. So roughly translating, thus Jove was the winner in that hunt, and he seized the nymph by force, holding her tight in his arms and speaking to her not like a god, but like a gentleman, kissing her on her reddened face. At the end of his love-making, he set all of her on fire and lay with her in that thick cloud with pleasure felt by both more than once. An interesting interpretation of the passage. The anthropomorphic cloud representing Jupiter's divine being has also been seen by Fabianski as the result of a textual contamination. According to him, Correggio's choice of depicting the enamored god in this vaporous form resulted from the fusion of two different metamorphic narratives, the myth of Io and that of Ixion, which Correggio may have known not only through Ovid's Metamorphoses, but also through the Ibis, which, as Frank Colson demonstrated yesterday, was a much more widely known poem in the Renaissance than I had realized. So I would like to venture that possibly there's a reference to the Ibis here. Correggio also might have known the story of Ixion through Lucian's Dialogue of the Gods, a text that had been cited by the mentioned courtier and humanist Mario Equicola in his own treatise on the nature of love. And just as a side note, this Mario Equicola was Isabella d'Este's personal secretary, and Isabella d'Este was, of course, Federico Gonzaga's mother. And Mario Equicola was a kind of literary and cultural tastemaker in the Gonzaga court, and he was also one of the sort of courtiers, 16th century poets, humanists, who was said to translate Chanson de Geste into Italian. So he may have been responsible. If indeed Correggio was aware of Chanson de Geste, he was probably responsible for it. But Correggio's ingenious solution for representing the lovers amidst a thick, dark cloud should also be understood in the context of Renaissance artistic theory and practice. Leonardo da Vinci, in his Libro di Pittura, advises fellow artists to look closely at the forms that naturally appear on the surface of ancient walls and stones, or sometimes amidst ashes, clouds, or muddy pools. For one might find in these most wondrous inventions, invenzioni mirabilissime, from which the artist's imagination can create fantastical battle scenes, landscapes, and chimerical creatures. For 15th and 16th century Italian artists, clouds were then both a wonderfully creative medium and a potent catalyst for new artistic inventions. So by transforming Jupiter into a cloud, Correggio was also fashioning himself a worthy peer of other great cloud painters, such as Mantegna and Raphael, whose works may have inspired his own invenzione. But in 1530-1531, clouds would have been very much on Correggio's mind for yet another reason. Can contemplate the image for a minute. From 1530 to 1534, the year of his death, Correggio worked on the largest and most ambitious artistic project of his career, the frescoes for the cupola of the cathedral in Parma. The subject of this monumental painting was the Assumption of the Virgin, shown here as she rises from her tomb toward heaven. And I know it's a bit complicated, and it's not easy to find the Virgin, but here she is. Okay, on this cloudy platform being lifted into heaven by this crowd of music-making angels, and the heavens have opened up to reveal a whole host of heavenly celebrities, all of whom are also very difficult to identify, but the first one that is very visible is Eve, who's shown holding an apple. And then there's very ambiguous figure up here that no scholar seems to agree as to who he is. Some may think it's Jesus Christ, some think that it's the angel Gabriel coming to receive the Virgin. And the conceit of the cupola is down below here on the edge. It's very difficult for you to read this image because of how the photograph is framed, but you can see these bearded men looking up. There's another one back here, but there's one that's visible here. These are the apostles, and this image comes from apocryphal texts about the Virgin, especially the Golden Legend, and the moment that is represented is the moment when the apostles have laid the Virgin in her grave, and she miraculously is taken to heaven. So the conceit is that, here we are down below, we're looking up at the Virgin from her grave, right? And so we are in the picture. Correggio's composition represented a radical reimagining of this traditional religious subject. Painted de sotto in su, Correggio's Assumption presents the Virgin's entrance into the heavenly kingdom not as a formal, static moment, but rather as a joyful, rapturous process to which we are made witnesses and to some extent participants. But as John Shearman has argued, as innovative as Correggio's composition may have been, it was deeply rooted in the local traditions of sacre rappresentazioni, that is, sacred religious plays, in which clouds would have concealed the theatrical machinery necessary to produce the dramatic, miraculous appearance of certain characters. Conceived during the same period, Correggio's Io and his Assumption share a number of important traits that reveal some of the ways in which the artist approached these seemingly unrelated subjects. Both paintings presented him with the challenge of giving visual form to the union between God and mortal. But while the Virgin is shown in an upward journey toward a brilliant golden light, Jove's dark cloud descends upon Io, blotting out daylight. Yet in both paintings, clouds appear as a mediating presence between mortal and immortal. And in both images, union with the Godhead is depicted as an ecstatic, transformative experience. The concept of laetitia, that is, the experience of an inner spiritual joy, that informed our discussion of Correggio's Portrait of a Lady and the Punishment of Hera, is also central to these two later works. That the experience of spiritual joy should be a key component to the representation of the Virgin's Assumption is, of course, not at all that surprising, especially if we consider other of Correggio's religious paintings, where his tender, affectionate style of representing the saints and the Christ child bespeak his belief in a direct, intimate rapport between individual worshippers and God. And just to contextualize that statement a little bit, I want to two examples of religious paintings by Correggio. This one is the Madonna De San Girolamo, also known as the Day, Il Giorno, and it's painted in 1528, so it's roughly contemporary with the work on the cupola and the work on the mythologist, a little earlier than that. And what you see here is St. Jerome standing very erect, like a solid pillar of the church that he is, and then the group here of the Madonna and Mary Magdalene is very different. It's much more fluid and emotional. You have this very sweet image of the Madonna looking at the Christ child very lovingly, and then of course you have this incredibly tender and intimate moment, this exchange between the Magdalene and the Christ child. The Christ child is placing his hand on the Magdalene, and the Magdalene is holding his little foot, and this kind of intimate, tender style representing the relationship between the saints and the Christ child becomes for Correggio a kind of metaphor, model for how the viewer should himself, as a faithful Christian, relate to God himself. And my other example is this painting, which is, of course, at the National Gallery in London. So I highly recommend that you go see it after this if you haven't yet. And of course, the same model for the Io is here posing as the Virgin. And what is very striking to me is that in both images, even though the subjects are very different, Correggio really relies on hands and the evocation of touch to communicate the sense of intimacy, of tender, affectionate intimacy with divinity. So what is truly surprising about Correggio's Io is how he infuses an extremely sensual and pagan subject with his own signature laetitia, turning a potentially lewd representation into a delightful contemplation on the nature of love, the pleasures of the imagination, the rivalry between painting and poetry, and the contrast between pagan and Christian manifestations of divine love. I wonder if we could see in Correggio's Io a pictorial model of confiscation and correction akin to that employed by Neo-Latin poets in their own reinterpretation of Ovid's works. And I throw the statement as a sort of an open question. Perhaps some of you can help me think through how what Correggio is doing is similar and or different from what we've seen several of the Renaissance poets doing with Ovid's texts. For unlike the Portrait of a Lady and the Punishment of Hera, the Io does not present the viewer with a literary riddle that can only be solved through knowledge of a single text or word. Rather, it presents us with a mythological subject in which the relationship between text and image remains open-ended, eliciting numerous possible interpretations from the spectator. While the frescoes on the cupola of the cathedral at Parma constituted Correggio's public apotheosis as an artist, the mythologies he painted for Federico Gonzaga represented a more private, personal triumph. Although he had painted other classical subjects before, the Io constituted an important departure from his earlier treatment of ancient art and literature. With this painting, Correggio declared himself a visual poet, an artist who, like Ovid himself, was capable of updating the classical tradition through a playful, humorous, sensual reinterpretation of well-known myths. Given Correggio's linguistic sensibility and his appreciation for wordplay, evident in his transformation of his own name, it is also possible that the Io was meant to be read as a kind of rebus. In Italian, the nymph's name, Io, and the first-person singular pronoun are, of course, homophones. So what we have here is an elegant fusion of word and image, of antiquity and modernity, which was also a witty statement of the artist's identity, Io, Correggio, the painter of Laetitia, who, like Ovid before him, transforms received mythological tradition into an expression of his own personal style. Painted at the height of Correggio's success as a modern Lombard artist, at a moment when he was poised to become a painter of even greater, one might even say national, somewhat anachronistic use of national, but national renown, the Io heralded a new phase in his career. Although much smaller in scale, the Io was in many ways as ambitious a composition as the Assumption. But the great promise latent in both works was never to be fully realized. In 1534, while still in his 40s, Correggio died, leaving behind him beautiful, tantalizing suggestions of what could have been. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for that wonderful talk, which showed me far more in this paper than I've ever seen before.
Including this tag.
I was wondering what was going on in the top left hand. Is that just clouds?
It's just a cloud, yeah. So there's a little bit, yes. So there's just a little bit of sort of air or sky breaking through. And the reason I think that he does that, well, there are many reasons he does that. Let's see if I can find. Okay, so this is the Ganymede, which I mentioned earlier. It's clearly a pendant to the Io, and I think it's a very conscious choice on the part of Correggio to leave a little bit of blue so that we are reminded that this is a daytime love affair, right? And that this is clearly being contrasted with the very bright composition of the Ganymede.
Right. I mean, if there is some sort of pagan Christian interference going on, how relevant is it that Io is really the only character in the Met who descends to the level of the beast and then comes back to being human, then goes up to being a divinity.
Right.
As I said, so might that this sort of Christian sort of quality be linked to that in any sense, do you think?
I think so. I mean, look, the truth is that we have no writings by Correggio, right, at all, other than contracts. So we need to sort of put together possible frames of interpretation based on what I've been trying to delineate his iconographic models and all these various texts that he is being exposed to in one way or another. And I think that, you know, the more I think about it, the Io really is a kind of wonderful image for Correggio to experiment with this blending and blurring of the pagan and the Christian, because Io goes transformation from, you know, she goes through all the stages, right, from human to animal to divine, and so in some ways she really is in her story an emblem of the possibility of transcending human into divine form.
The pun would be nice because Alessandro Borghese wants to see a pun in Ovid when she traces her name.
Absolutely, yes.
Also, in Greek is woe is me.
Right. Yes. So yes, of course, I should have mentioned that as well. There is, of course, the moment where it was just in this way. Io sort of the anti-Narcissus. She knows immediately, right, that she's like, that's her, and she identifies herself for her father, right? And yes, that's very good. Thank you. I had momentarily forgotten about this wonderful moment in the story of Io, but absolutely.
Perhaps John.
There is surely a great ambivalence, isn't there, about the way it's represented?
Ambivalence.
I quite see that she is responding, if you like, affectionately with her arms, but she's being overwhelmed, and she's off balance, isn't she? There's a great force driving her, whatever that cloud or pour or whatever it is that's driving her down.
Fantastic flow, I was thinking. Fantastic flow.
Yeah.
Love is fire, so.
There is an enormous effort of force being used here, isn't there? You can't entirely eliminate that, I would have thought.
Okay, I mean, I see your point, but hold on a second. Let's see if I can. How can I see my slides? Hold on a second. Let's see if I can launch this in such a way that I can see. What? I'm sorry?
You have to look for the PowerPoint program because this is just a view.
Oh, right. Okay. So we can't do that. Okay. Now it doesn't seem to want to move. Okay. Oh, here. Maybe if I. It's not moving. Okay, so I'll instead of relying on the image, you'll have to just bear with me with my description, which is that I think you're right that the pose looks very uncomfortable to us, but this iconography of the woman in this kind of precarious balance in the arms of a man being kissed, which you see in the Ira Grimani, but we also see in sarcophagi and in other ancient monuments, and that gets picked up by Raphael, and then it gets picked up by, I haven't mentioned the artists that actually use the pose to represent very graphic representations of the sexual act. It becomes, I think, for the Renaissance viewer and for the Renaissance art, it becomes a code for intense passion, far more than uncomfortable sitting position. Even though it looks completely unnatural, but you see what I'm saying? In the language, in the visual language of the period, which is drawing from these images of nymphs and maenads throwing their heads back in ecstasy. That is really the most important signifier, I think, here.
Well, I'm sure that is a very strong signifier, certainly.
Ingo?
Since you mentioned that he then fashioned the punishment of Hera, which in Homer comes sort of right after the Eos are the deception of Zeus by Hera. I'm wondering whether that image is also alluding to the epithet that Homer endows Zeus with just before the Hieros Gamos, and that is named the Legetera, Zeus. Zeus is the cloud gatherer.
Right, that's lovely. Thank you.
Reading Ovid's Io episode.
Right, he's.
Actual with that
that is beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. No, that is
exactly who it was.
That's right. I've seen that cloud before. I know what it means. Yeah. No, that's beautiful. Thank you. That's wonderful.
Other questions?
Yeah, just to point to sort of continuity with the previous paper, in that this is Maggie was saying that if you're looking in Ovid for examples of reciprocal love, they're hard to find.
Mm-hmm.
So in this, Flora's one case, but this is a case where he's actually creating in Ovid, since there seems to be a desire to search for models for that, reciprocal love or married love or just equal love, however one terms it. And show in several ways. That's what he's doing.
I agree
whether
with...
it's, connecting it with the Virgin and God, whether it's just imagining the passionate relationship in and of itself. To me, that's one of the most striking things that you brought out here.
Thank you, John. That's a really wonderful comment, and I agree with you completely. But I was actually talking to Len yesterday because one of the concepts that came through in her talk about Pantano was this tendency towards adoucissement, right? I can't even translate that. I mean, of rendering tender, rendering soft, rendering sweet. All these episodes of Ovid, right? And so I was talking to Len exactly about this, and I think Correggio is very much doing the same thing. He's trying to adoucir these narratives, all of which are actually very violent, right? They're not really, for the human partner, they're really not that pleasant.
Right, it says he held her back, and then he snatched away her poodle.
Yeah.
So they're all violent.
Very violent, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Just one more question.
This is just a silly question, but is that the rear end of a cow on the piece?
No, sorry, it's an amphora. That's not a silly question. I'm very sorry. If you can go to Vienna to see this painting, you should, because it's really quite extraordinary, and everything is much more legible actually in the original. But this is an amphora, which is of course an ancient motif for representing rivers or bodies of water. One might also read it more salaciously because amphoras are of course also visual puns on the woman's body, right? So there's a long ancient tradition of amphoras being representative of the woman's body. So one could read that amphora in a number of possible ways.
But the urn and other river bodies almost tilted over?
So yeah, sometimes, but not always. Not always. Yeah.
Is the whole thing an amphora, or is there something on top of it?
There's I wished let's see if
Never fur?
no, fur. She's not turning into an animal. I swear she isn't. Let's see if I restart it again.
It's mink.
No, it's not letting me. Let's see. Let's see. Okay. So no, it is not mink. It is not fur, and it is this rocky, earthy formation. Okay. So she's sitting. There's some water. There's a stream here from which the stag is drinking, and to reinforce that this is a body of water, we get the amphora, and then we have the strange rocky formation that partly mimics or replicates the same strange cloud formation that the nymph on the Raphael ceiling is sitting on. But what is fascinating to me is that if you look at the cloudy body of Jupiter, he's lacking another arm, right? So it's weird because he goes through these two kind of metamorphic no, it's true. He has double metamorphoses because he is a cloud, and with one sort of cloudy hand, he holds her, and this looks like his other hand, almost as if he's becoming every element, right, to catch her. So that's what's going on. It's a fun painting. Yeah, it is meant to be playful. I mean, Correggio didn't call himself Lytus for nothing, right?
This will be the last one.
Do we know if we have the whole painting?
Yes, we're pretty sure we have the whole painting. Yes.
Okay, well, I think it's tea time now.